Teaching a dialectical philosopher such as Adorno is no easy task. One thing I think that helps is a wonderful cliche such as the one that begins, that lends its title, I suppose, to section 22 here on page 43 of Minima, Moralia. Baby with the bathwater. Many of you have probably not spent much time with the philosophy of Georg Hegel. You may not have read Karl Marx's Das Kapital, or even the Communist Manifesto, or the German ideology. You may have no clue what the term determinate negation means, for instance, in dialectical philosophy, but hopefully a few of you have heard of the expression, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, even the expression, the cliche, is now dated. Many of you have probably never heard this cliche either. But in the old days, people didn't have pipes in their home that would take the water away. You would put water into a bath, and when you were done bathing, maybe you even reuse that water through several members of your family. And when the baby, for example, was done being bathed, you would have to get rid of that bath water and throw it out. Use a chamber pot or dump it out the window or wherever the heck you put your dirty water. And of course the expression is, when you're getting rid of the dirty water, you don't want to get rid of the baby too, right? And now, of course, it becomes a sort of general expression then for any situation where there's something bad going on and something good going on, right? Dirty water, beautiful little baby being cleaned. You want to get rid of the bad stuff, throw out the dirty water. You don't want to get rid of the clean baby. Okay, so we can understand, hopefully, this cliche that lends its title to section 22. Let's have a look at this section in more detail. Among the motifs of cultural criticism, a sort of running theme in the history of cultural criticism, one of the most long established and central is that of the lie. That culture creates the illusion of a society worthy of man, which does not exist. That it conceals the material conditions upon which all human works rise, and that comforting and lulling, like a lullaby, it serves to keep alive the bad economic determination of existence. In other words, is culture's function essentially ideological? Does it exist to sort of whitewash and adorn, to borrow from Adorno's name here for a minute, to adorn an otherwise rather pathetic, wretched existence for most human beings? Struggle for survival, a contest for power and respect and dignity. This is the notion of culture as ideology, which appears at first sight common to both the bourgeois doctrine of violence and its adversary. So what is the bourgeois doctrine of violence that he has in mind here? Nietzsche. Its adversary, Marx. Nietzsche, the theoretician of aggrieved white supremacists, ultimately, perhaps, in the history of ideas here. Though Nietzsche himself would be rolling in his grave, the thought that such pathetic racists would misuse his work in such fashion, but they did, right? Starting with the Nazis, perhaps even earlier, his sister, basically, and her anti-Semitic husband, editing Nietzsche's complete work while he was an invalid at the end of his life, no longer able to have control of his own literary au revoir. The bourgeois doctrine of violence, right? The powerful deserve to be powerful. Anybody, any group in a society. This is not really Nietzsche. I mean, there's also social Darwinism here going on, with the idea being, right, just power politics between different groups, and whoever wins that struggle is then authorized to, without any guilt, dominate others. Sort of healthy, aristocratic, and just utterly reactionary political implications of Nietzsche's philosophy. Marx as the antithesis here, right? Somebody advocating for the proletariat, the working class. Precisely, and so And what Adorno is pointing out here is both Nietzsche, though, and Marx see culture as largely ideological and weaponize it in a sense, right? So now, right, both thinkers would agree because culture is basically ideological. Those of us creating culture as authors, artists, poets, dramatists, musicians, composers, etc., right? We need to recognize the ideological function of our art, and we need to then be savvy in how we pursue our political projects through art. Precisely this notion, like all expostulation about lies, right? So now anytime you find thinkers justifying deception, we should have alarm bells going off. It's okay to lie to people so long as you lead them to the right place. It's a sense in which different thinkers that are opposed politically can agree on this. Precisely this notion, like all expostulation about lies, has a suspicious tendency to become itself ideology. This can be seen on the private level. Inexorably, the thought of money and all its attendant conflicts extends into the most tender, erotic, the most sublime spiritual relationships. Boy, doesn't it, right? I'm not even sure we understand what a most tender, erotic, or sublime spiritual relationship even is anymore, simply because the thought of money and its attendant conflicts has already permeated these spheres to where, for example, two young folks in love are going to be as concerned about the potential earning, the earning potential of their mate, as they are about any other qualities. For example, spiritual relationships between, say, the member of some faith and some authority in that faith easily become transactional. Think about many Americans in this country who are wealthy and like to pursue Buddhism as a kind of hobby, spiritual hobby, pay thousands and thousands and tens of thousands and whatever dollars to attend enlightenment workshops at resorts and whatnot, right? And that becomes very transactional and frankly absurd, right? If you want to reach the highest level of enlightenment, you got to sign up for this package, right? And spend more money if you want the highest level of enlightenment. But if you want a discount, we'll give you the sort of middle level. And again, I'm not trying to disparage Buddhism, which is one of the world's major religions. I mean, we find this phenomenon also in evangelical Christianity with the sort of gospel of prosperity. It permeates many different religious traditions, and corrupts them, he thinks, and turns them from their original sublimity into something much crasser, right? A mere transaction of cash, and then maybe some title or some certification that one receives in return. With the logic of coherence and the pathos of truth, cultural criticism could therefore demand that relationships be entirely reduced to their material origin, ruthlessly and openly formed according to the interests of the participants. For meaning, as we know, is not independent of genesis. And so the origins of something matter, and it is easy to discern in everything that cloaks or mediates the material. Anytime we find anything in our culture claiming to not merely be an economic transaction, it's easy to discern the trace of insincerity there, sentimentality, indeed precisely a concealed and doubly poisonous interest to appear as what it is not, right? In a sense, testifying all the more, right, to what it actually is, a mere transaction. Cultural capital, as they sometimes say, right? That the very expression, cultural capital, giving evidence of what he's getting at here. To act radically in accordance with this principle would be to extirpate with the false all that was true also, right? So to say that, culture was always a lie. It was always a whitewashing of the material reality. People are struggling to survive. Some come out better than others and dominate those others. Large groups of people are basically reduced to a condition of bondage. So we could just say culture's all a lie, quit, it's all just a bunch of dead white people. There's a variety of ways to essentially dismiss the entire traditions, multiple traditions and throw it all out. That is, though Adorno thinks, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So let's not get rid of all of our culture and try to start over again. We'll doom ourselves, he thinks, to a repetition of some of the worst things in history. Instead, let's try to follow through the rest of this section and see what Adorno is up to here. In the cultural critics after Nietzsche, this reversal of position has always been obvious. Spengler endorsed it enthusiastically. Oswald Spengler, author of Decline of the West. This reversal of position, right? So to act, let's back up a little bit here. To act radically in accordance with this principle, right, of reducing all ideology to just a superficial whitewashing of an underlying material reality that is the truth and the power struggle there. He says, if we do this, though, we throw out what is true in culture, what is more than just a whitewashing of material reality, what represents something like a marking of, human beings trying to improve their lot, trying to work together in solidarity to change the world for the better, to overcome things like war and racism, for example. So we don't want to throw away all that was true also in our culture, all that, however impotently, right? So maybe seeing that play, it's not as though that meant leaving the theater, that your life was going to be transformed the way that maybe the play or the drama might be suggesting, right? And so sometimes, maybe just viewing some drama feels impotent, right? Because you don't take that with you when you then go back into your regular life. But if we get rid of these aspects of culture, right, all that was true also strives to escape the confines of universal practice. Every chimerical anticipation of a nobler condition, right, the utopian function of art, and so to bring about directly the barbarism that culture is reproached with furthering indirectly. So in other words, one way to ensure barbarism is to throw the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of Western culture in toto, in its entirety. Let's just get rid of it all and start over from scratch, right? And there's a sense in this, that you might even view the Nazis as attempting something like this, right? Creating a sort of new culture that was going to break with the weakness of the past. Well, can we think of anything more barbaric than Nazi culture? Well, they had a culture, right? Go and watch The Big Lebowski. One of my favorite scenes in that film is where the dude, played by Jeff Bridges, is, talking about the folks who have come into his apartment and stolen his rug, and or at least are associated, right, with the rug taking, or maybe I'm actually mixing up, I think, the guys who stole his rug and the guys who are responsible for the kidnapping, or at least claim to be responsible for the kidnapping. Anyways, he's trying to explain, who these guys are, and one of them, maybe, or two of them have German accents, and so he tells Walter, his friend, played by John Goodman, that they were Germans, and Walter immediately assumes they must be Nazis to be doing such a terrible thing to his friend, and the dude has to tell Walter, no, they're not Nazis, they claim to be nihilists, right? They said they're nihilists and they believe in nothing, and Walter's response, of course, is one of the funniest lines in that movie, where he basically says, well, boy, if they're nihilists, that's even worse than Nazis. Nazis had what Walter calls an ethos. That is, they had some semblance of a culture. Nihilists have nothing at all, right? They believe in absolutely nothing. So there's a joke there, but underlying that joke, right, is the idea that, there was this attempt by the Nazis to have an ethos and a culture. And I think Adorno, right, is pointing out that culture was even worse than the problem it claimed to be a solution to put it mildly. Okay, in the cultural critics after Nietzsche, this reversal of position has always been obvious. Spengler endorsed it enthusiastically. Right, decline of the West. The West is sick. We have to have a new culture. Boy, there's a pretty smooth transition from Oswald Spengler right into Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and the Nazis. Marxists are not proof against it either, right? So Adorno, who's often considered a Marxist, um, is a critic of Marxism, certainly a critic of Stalinism. And so he's also pointing out, right, that just because somebody is or claims to be a Marxist, they don't get out of this danger either. Cured of the social democratic belief in cultural progress and confronted with growing barbarism, they are under constant temptation to advocate the latter in the interest of the objective tendency. In other words, they have to just say, and he's really thinking of Stalin here too, right? Yes, there's going to be barbarism. People are going to lose their lives. Some people will starve to death. Many people will be crippled by the necessities of some production process. And yet, that's just what we have to do to raise our industry to a certain level, so that we can then provide for everyone. So, curative, yes, these Marxist leaders are under the constant temptation to basically say we all have to tighten our belts and sacrifice in order to catch up with the West, was the way that these Eastern nations would present it, right? We're behind. We are behind in our economic development. We need to catch up with the Brits, with the French, with the Americans. And that requires, an acceptance of growing barbarism. It's too bad that we have to do it this way, but we're in a race. Apart from this, he says emphasis on the material element, as against the spirit as a lie, gives rise to a kind of dubious affinity with that political economy which is subjected to an imminent criticism, comparable with the complicity between police and underworld. So there's a kind of illicit and shady relationship going on here. And he's comparing, right, sort of relation between what is not material in culture and material interest and concerns, money concerns, etc., to the interests that police and criminals share. And what is that interest? Well, they're part of the criminal justice system, for example, in this country. And they are locked in a sort of unhealthy relationship where they both need each other. Where, for example, where, for instance, retrograde and racist drug laws are kept on the books, for example, because the idea of laying off too many police officers at once seems not feasible. There's an example, right, of this kind of dubious affinity between the police and criminals. It seems like they're locked in a kind of relationship where they need each other to some degree. Since utopia was set aside, and the unity of theory and practice demanded, we have become all too practical. Fear of the impotence of theory, and boy, these fears are only more pronounced since Adorno's time. God help you if you're just somebody who likes to follow through an idea to its logical implications without concern for its practical benefits or implications. Fear of the impotence of theory supplies a pretext for bowing to the almighty production process. And it certainly does in this country. It is the main pretext. God help you if what you're doing doesn't do anything that makes stuff happen in this world. And then ultimately this leads to the raising or elevation of the production process and the so-called market as the ultimate arbiter of any kind of value. Traits of malice are not alien even to authentic Marxist language, and today there's a growing resemblance between the business mentality and sober critical judgment, between vulgar materialism and the other kind of materialism, the non-vulgar materialism, although here the so-called scientific materialism of the Soviet Union, so that it is at times difficult properly to distinguish subject and object. And I think what he's getting at here is, both the capitalism in countries such as the United States and Britain, and communism on offer in the Soviet Union have more in common, frankly, he thinks, than either party would like to believe. They're both two different forms of a kind of totalitarian, totally administered surveillance police state, more or less. And it's just a matter of how you do that, rather than any fundamental difference between the two. Okay, let's keep going. To identify culture solely with lies is more fateful than ever, now that the former is really becoming totally absorbed by the latter. That is, culture is becoming absorbed by lies, and eagerly invites such identification in order to compromise every opposing thought. He's getting at sort of how, some new art form like film, for instance, becomes kind of commodified in Hollywood, and then you get the sort of cranking out of formula films, as opposed to what the original possibilities of film are, as represented by Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, the early Marx Brothers, and various other film artists. Since, however, free and honest exchange is itself a lie, that is, the idea that there is a free market, that it's easy to and transparent to understand how it works. To deny free and honest exchange is at the same time to speak for truth. So since free and honest exchange is itself a lie, to deny that it's taking place is at the same time to speak for truth. For example, right, most individuals who work for some organization do not freely enter into a contract where they actually have leverage. For the most part, they have to accept what they're given, and if they demand anything beyond that, they will not have a position, right? But we can contrast that with certain professions where there's a lot of leverage and give and take, right? That's more like free and honest exchange. Whereas for most people, right, you don't have the leverage of, I don't know, Tom Brady negotiating his next contract with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, or with any professional athlete, right, who has maybe choices. I can play for team A or B. I don't have to accept team B's offer. I can, negotiate here the terms. In the face of the lie of the commodity world, right, that it's a simple matter of free and honest exchange, even the lie that denounces it becomes a corrective. So even if it's interesting. So he's making a case even for stretching the truth a bit here. That culture so far has failed is no justification for furthering its failure. By strewing the store of good flour on the spilt beer like the girl in the fairy tale boy. We'd have to go back and probably read the original edition of the Grimm fairy tales to catch that reference. People who belong together ought neither to keep silent about their material interests. That's a certain kind of, and that is, typical in bourgeois circles even to the present day, right? Don't talk about money concerns, it's vulgar. Nor to sink to their level, nor, to only think that's what matters, but to assimilate them by reflection into their relationships and so surpass them. So he wants us to sort of overcome this opposition between pretending as though material interests don't matter and that we're better than them, on the one hand. On the other hand, pretending that material interests and money concerns are all that matters and that everything is reducible to them. Either of those is a form of the lie, deception. And so what we need to do, though, is assimilate them by reflection into their relationships. Understand them as sort of pointing to something that's fundamentally going wrong in our political economy, and how, in a sense, there's nothing we can do as private individuals, maybe, to overcome that, but there is something that we could do together. And I think it's by building that kind of solidarity and class consciousness that you will ultimately surpass either of these unacceptable alternatives. All right, so let's have a look at the next two sections. They're brief. Plurale tantum. If society, as a contemporary theory teaches, is really one of rackets, this is the racket theory of capitalism, basically, offered by Friedrich Pollock and others. Certainly an influence on the Frankfurt School. I'm not sure that they actually originated. The idea here, and let's make it very clear. Boy, it's never, I think, been clearer, actually. and with reference to the previous administration here, this is the idea that that the world and governments and businesses are essentially rackets. In other words, mafias, criminal gangs, and the world is run by criminal gangs. Some of these gangs, call themselves the government. Some of these gangs call themselves business leaders, whatever. What they are essentially are rackets. They operate. And so I think what this theory does is it studies the history of rackets and of criminal enterprises, organized crime, the mafia, for instance, in Italy. It studies that history, and then it applies that framework to understanding political and economic power in the contemporary world. So, if society is really just rackets, just criminal gangs, then its most faithful model is the precise opposite of the collective, namely the individual as a monad, as an isolated unit. By tracing the absolutely particular interests of each individual, I'm trying to get ahead, so are you. I want a better life for myself, so do you. The nature of the collective in a false society can be most accurately studied, and it is by no means far-fetched to consider the organization of divergent drives under the primacy of an ego answering the reality principle, and this is Freud's psychological theory here, as from the first an internalized robber band with leader, followers, ceremonies, oaths of allegiance, betrayals, conflicts of interest, intrigues. Wow, that sounds a little bit familiar. One need only observe outbursts in which the individual asserts himself energetically against his environment. For instance, rage. Thinking here of Kimberly Guilfoyle announcing loudly, with a hysterical kind of rage, that the best is yet to come. Still waiting on that. The enraged man always appears as the gang leader. I mean, incidentally, Kimberly Guilfoyle, the current wife of Donald Trump Jr., the former wife of Gavin Newsom. This is a little personal aside, right? But if you're wondering, right, about the sort of about how the ruling class, despite ostensible political differences, has much more in common. You can kind of see this just by the sort of social circles in which such folks move. It turns out, these folks largely move in the same circles and may have more in common, ultimately, than they do. Dividing them, at least amongst the would-be billionaire ruling class. One need only observe outbursts in which the individual asserts himself energetically against his environment. For instance, rage. Kimberly Guilfoyle. You can think of plenty of other folks too, right? Having outbursts, right? Tired of having to wear this dang mask. Tired of having to stay home, etc. I'm going to I'm going to freak out about this in public, and then somebody's going to record me on the phone, and next thing you know, there's a scandal. The enraged man always appears as the gang leader of his own self. I think what Adorno is doing here is he's saying that we can actually apply this theory of rackets not merely to, the world and societies today. We can even apply it to an understanding of individual psychology. This so-called individual as monad is actually a sort of criminal enterprise itself, with the superego, perhaps, the gang leader here. I don't know. The enraged man always appears as the gang leader of his own self, giving his unconscious, so the id here, the order to pull no punches, right? Fight like hell. His eyes shining with the satisfaction of speaking for the many that he himself is. The id here, these desires, represents the multitude. The more someone has espoused the cause of his own aggression, the more perfectly he represents the repressive principle of society, which runs on this kind of aggression and intimidation, scaring people into staying in their lanes and just doing their jobs and doing what they're told. In this sense, more than in any other, perhaps, the proposition is true that the most individual is the most general. This helps us, I think, understand, the relationship of authoritarian strongmen and their base, right? In a sense, an authoritarian strongman is able to resonate with a base because this authoritarian may, for instance, have this kind of base or multitude within themselves, within their own unruly desires and appetites and impulses at war with each other, already in their own individual psychology. That's the thesis anyways. All right, one more section here, Tough Baby, section 24. There's a certain gesture of virility, manliness, machismo, that calls for suspicion. Well, sure, okay. It expresses independence, sureness of the power to command, the tacit complicity of all males. Earlier, this was called, with odd respect, the whim of the master, sort of master's arbitrary discretion to make a decision, can enforce it, doesn't need to worry about any court of law. Today it has been democratized, and film heroes show the most insignificant bank clerk how it is done. So we have, people in film and television enact this kind of overconfident machismo. It's often missing an intellectual component, sadly, other than just mere cunning. Its archetype is the handsome dinner-jacketed figure returning late to his bachelor flat. Boy, I'm thinking of like Frank Sinatra from one of these 1950s movies. Switching on the indirect lighting and mixing himself a whiskey and soda. Or maybe Bing Crosby. Or maybe both of them. The carefully recorded hissing of the mineral water says what the arrogant mouth keeps to itself, that he despises anything that does not smell of smoke, leather, and shaving cream. Particularly women, which is why they, precisely, find him irresistible. So there's a certain kind of construction here of masculinity that Adorno is calling our attention to and criticizing. For him, the ideal form of human relations is the club, and the club, the sort of male exclusive club. The arena of a respect founded on scrupulous unscrupulousness. The pleasures of such men are rather the pleasure of their models, right? They're often modeling their behavior on these sort of idealized types they see represented in film and television, right? Seldom equal to reality, that's for sure. Okay, most of these businessmen at their Elks Club having cigars, playing poker, are not fulfilling what you see on the screen with Sinatra and Bing Crosby, for instance, in the 1940s, 50s, or what have you, in these kinds of musical films. People are even now better than their culture. All have about them a latent violence. This violence seems a threat directed against others, of whom such a one, sprawling in his easy chair, has long ceased to have need. In fact, it is past violence against himself. So again, trying to move from the sort of social to the individual here. If all pleasure has preserved within it earlier pain, then here pain, as pride in bearing it, is raised directly, untransformed, as a stereotype to pleasure. Unlike wine, each glass of whiskey, each inhalation of cigar smoke, still recalls the repugnance that it cost the organism to become attuned to such strong stimuli. So sure, drinking whiskey and smoking cigars is an acquired taste and requires us to overcome natural repugnance, right? If you don't believe me, if you've never tried this stuff, try it, and your first impulse will be to vomit. And that'll be your second impulse. And that might even be your 12th impulse. After maybe a few weeks, you'll develop the ability to enjoy these things, perhaps without making a scowling expression as you try to inhale the cigar smoke or drink the whiskey. He-men are thus, in their own constitution, what film plots usually present them to be: masochists. At the root of their sadism is a lie, and only as liars do they truly become sadists, agents of repression. This lie, however, is nothing other than repressed homosexuality presenting itself as the only approved form. So this was, I think, pretty typical in the mid-20th century. And here's one thing I think about Adorno's Freudianism that is today deeply questionable. And so I'm actually going to leave this psychological thesis where it's lying here and move on. I don't think there's much that can be redeemed here, but he's not wrong in drawing attention, right, to a phenomenon that many of us are familiar with. I'm sure there's a name for it in the literature, and that is that often the most hyper-masculine men have a sort of repressed homosexuality that they're trying to overcompensate for. There's a sort of, this has become, I think, a cliche, frankly. nonetheless, we're seeing a sort of one place where this originally sort of appears in cultural criticism. Let's move forward. I'm not that interested in that thesis. I think it's you know, kind of overdone at this point, and boy, you know, our understanding of sexuality and of gender is just evolving, evolving so much that it's hard to even understand how to take language from Adorno's time and put it into contemporary terms. In Oxford, right? And Adorno had been to Oxford before he comes to America, fleeing Germany, stops off in England for a year or two before making his way to the United States. So he's familiar with Oxford. In Oxford, two sorts of students are distinguished: the tough guys and the intellectuals, right? Guys on the football, the rugby team or whatever, and then the folks in the libraries learning, studying their Latin and Greek very closely. The latter, through this contrast alone, that is, intellectuals, just merely by being contrasted with tough guys, are almost automatically equated with the effeminate. There is much reason, and so this is part of, you know, the tradition of anti-intellectualism that does become pretty predominant in places like the United States, right? So this is another dimension to American anti-intellectualism, equating intellectual pursuits with effeminacy and various kinds of disparagement, nerd, for instance, these kinds of terms, whereas, you know, some rather muscular guys who like to throw a ball around a field and prance around in tights, jumping over imaginary lines on a field, are somehow, you know, very manly, in contrast, supposedly. There's much reason to believe that the ruling stratum, on its way to dictatorship, and he thinks, right, this is where all of the governments of his time, right, are moving, right, is towards sort of total administration over their subjects, becomes polarized. So the ruling stratum becomes polarized toward these two extremes. Boy, and, you know, we could even see today polarization in this country along these lines. We got phony tough guys and patriots on the one hand, and sort of bureaucrats and, again, right, effeminate intellectuals or something from the perspective of the tough guys, at least on the other hand, right? You can still see dimensions of what Adorno's getting at here. Okay. In the end, he says, the tough guys, right, and so this is the kind of reversal. This would certainly make Zizek happy. I guess Zizek picked up his little strategy of flipping the script here by reading thinkers like Adorno. In the end, the tough guys are the truly effeminate ones, who need the weaklings as their victims in order not to admit that they are like them. There is, I think, a profound psychological insight at work here. Just leaving aside, for instance, language about homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think there's a really interesting insight into the, you know, psychopathology of toxic masculinity here. Right? If you're so tough, then why do you need to constantly pick on somebody more vulnerable than you, just to sort of prove to yourself, apparently, that you are what you want to be, and that you are different and better than others. Like there must be a terrible lack of self-esteem, right? For instance, and an uncertainty about one's actual own identity, a lack of integrity at the end of the day. Totalitarianism and homosexuality belong together. Again, I'm going to leave that just lying there. In its downfall, the subject negates everything, which is not of its own kind. So there is this kind of mania to reduce everything to just one, you know, to one set of terms. The opposites of the strong man and the compliant youth merge in an order which asserts unalloyed the male principle of domination. And we still have, you know, a lot of this present today: the wage gap, the double standards, the hypocrisy between genders, and making, right, and still, right, men in a position of privilege and predominance, even today, right, many decades after Adorno's writing this, and making all, without exception, even supposed subjects, its objects. This principle becomes totally passive, virtually feminine. So again, the equation of the passive and the feminine, I think, is also problematic here. Adorno's up to something interesting there. I think that has some redeeming value, but then it's, I think, weighed down by reflections on sexuality and gender that are largely obsolete these days and have been long since sort of left behind. And the discourse today on these topics is much more, I think, informed by a variety of previously marginalized perspectives. And so this really, elements of what Adorno's saying there really read like a kind of conventional conservative Freudianism at times. Okay, we've done what we can do with these passages for now. Thank you for joining me.